The morning began with the kind of stillness that usually meant trouble was brewing beneath the surface, even if the neighborhood itself looked deceptively peaceful. The lawns of Fairview Meadows glistened with dew, each blade lined up like it had been manicured by a perfectionist with too much time, too much power, and far too many opinions. It was the sort of suburb where image mattered more than reality, and where the homeowners association prided itself on enforcing a veneer of order so rigid that residents joked the trees needed permission to grow an extra branch. Most laughed when they said it. One person did not. Her name was Margaret Thornwell, but no one ever dared call her that. She was simply Karen, the reigning monarch of the HOA, self-appointed enforcer of all rules written and unwritten, and wielder of a level of confidence only achievable by someone who had no idea how little authority they actually possessed. She moved through the neighborhood like a security drone with a superiority complex, scrutinizing every porch mat, every mailbox, every car tire touching a centimeter of roadway that she didn't approve of. And unfortunately for her, and even more unfortunately for everyone else, she believed she possessed something she liked to call her master key. No one quite knew how many locks it supposedly opened, but she bragged that it granted her access to common areas, utility boxes, storage sheds, and anything she decided counted as HOA property. The disturbing part wasn't that she claimed to have such keys, but that she carried them around like a sheriff's badge she'd awarded herself without any competition. Which was ironic considering she had no idea who the real sheriff actually was. I had moved into Fairview Meadows 2 months earlier, purposefully quiet, low-key, and unremarkable. My house looked like every other one on the cul-de-sac. My yard met the standards of the HOA handbook, and my presence was unobtrusive enough that neighbors barely noticed when I came or went. That wasn't an accident. A sheriff learns over time that anonymity is often more powerful than authority, especially when assessing the ecosystem of a new town. And Fairview Meadows was an ecosystem all its own. I had already heard whispers about Karen within hours of moving in. Some stories were amusing, others irritating, and a few vaguely alarming. She had fined a resident for having holiday lights up 3 days past New Year's. She had demanded that someone repaint their shutters because the shade of navy wasn't the exact Pantone code listed in the HOA aesthetic guidelines. She once claimed the right to inspect the inside of a neighbor's garage for unauthorized objects, whatever that meant. Most people just tolerated her out of exhaustion, but the undercurrent of resentment toward her was strong enough that it practically hummed through the sidewalks. For my own reasons, I didn't intervene. I didn't flash a badge. I didn't announce my role in the county. I was there to live quietly, not to police my street. But Karen decided otherwise. It started with my car, an unremarkable black SUV with county plates generic enough that most people wouldn't give it a second glance. The windows were tinted, the interior clean, the exterior freshly washed every weekend. Nothing about it violated HOA rules. But in Karen's weekly patrols, she had fixated on it for reasons unknown. Perhaps because she didn't recognize the model. Perhaps because she suspected it was non-resident parking, despite the fact that it always sat neatly in my driveway. Or perhaps simply because she needed a new target to occupy her restless desire for control. On the morning of the incident, I watched from my home office window as she marched purposefully across the street. She clutched her heavy ring of keys, which jingled like wind chimes announcing impending misfortune. She wore a bright vest, as if on official duty, and an expression of moral righteousness that suggested she believed she was performing a public service. She walked straight toward my driveway. At first I assumed she was inspecting something near the property line. Maybe she wanted to measure grass height or find an excuse to leave a passive-aggressive warning on my front door. But then she stopped at my SUV. She circled it twice, one finger dragging along the paint as if checking for dust, her expression twisting into poorly contained disdain. Then she stopped at the driver door. That was when she pulled out her so-called master key. I froze for a moment, half amused, half stunned. She stared at the lock, twisting her head from angle to angle, trying to figure out which of the oversized keys might fit. The ring was large, too large. Some keys were old, some new, some clearly mismatched, and some looked suspiciously like they belonged to old storage units she had no legitimate connection to. She selected one with confidence and pressed it into my car door. It didn't budge. She jiggled it. She tried again. She stepped back, frowned, muttered something to herself, and picked another. She repeated the process with increasing frustration, her movements growing sharper as though the car had personally insulted her. Then she stepped back, huffed dramatically, and pulled something from her pocket, her phone. She dialed quickly and lifted it to her ear, pacing with the dramatic flair of a stage actress preparing for an award-winning performance. Her face twisted into indignation, then outrage, then the undistinguishable expression of someone exaggerating a situation beyond anything grounded in reality. I couldn't hear her words, but her gestures made it clear she was calling 911. Calling emergency services because her key didn't open my car. I didn't know whether to laugh, sigh, or grab a clipboard and start taking notes for training purposes. But one thing was certain. Dispatch would route the call immediately to our sheriff's office, which meant it would end up on my desk. A slow, inevitable turn of events had begun, and she had no idea she was about to summon the very person whose property she was tampering with. Nor did she have any idea that the county sheriff she was demanding help from was already watching her commit a Class A demonstration of what not to do in front of law enforcement. I stood silently behind my front door as she finished her melodramatic complaint to emergency services, waving her arms wildly as if she was reporting an armed robbery rather than having her delusions challenged by a car door. The moment she hung up, she glared once more at my SUV, accusing, suspicious, affronted, and marched back to the sidewalk to wait for the responding deputy. And I knew exactly who that deputy would be, because I was already grabbing my badge.
The call came through the radio exactly as expected, crackling with the unmistakable tone of someone reporting an emergency that was not, by any legal or logical definition, an emergency. Dispatch relayed the details in a steady voice accustomed to sorting genuine crises from suburban theatrics. Suspicious vehicle, possible unauthorized access, HOA member requesting immediate response. It was phrased carefully, diplomatically, the way dispatchers often handled situations involving self-important residents who believed discomfort qualified as danger. But the moment the street name came through, I knew the incident wasn't merely typical neighborhood noise. It was Karen, and she had doubled down. I stepped fully into uniform, clipped my radio to my vest, and grabbed my patrol SUV keys from the counter. My reflection in the hallway mirror looked ordinary enough, calm, professional, composed, but my thoughts were anything but. Rarely did my personal and professional worlds collide so abruptly, and even more rarely in a way this absurd. It was one thing for an HOA board member to overstep. It was another for her to involve emergency services because reality didn't conform to her imagined authority. The drive from my home to the responding route was short, but I took the long way out of necessity. I couldn't simply step out of my house and declare myself the arriving officer. That would risk accusations of conflict, even if the situation was trivial. Procedure mattered, and Karen's theatrics would require every ounce of professionalism I had. So I circled the block, let dispatch know I was en route, and approached the cul-de-sac from the main road like any other call. When I turned the corner, Karen was already standing in the middle of the street like she was summoning the cavalry to a battlefield that existed only in her imagination. She paced in tight, sharp circles near my driveway, her hands clutching her phone and her famous ring of so-called master keys. Her posture radiated outrage, as though she were the victim of an elaborate crime instead of the perpetrator of one. The moment she saw the sheriff's SUV roll in, she straightened to full height, lifted her chin, and positioned herself to intercept the responding officer. She had no idea that the officer was me. No idea that the car she tried, illegally, to break into belonged to the same person now pulling up in full uniform. No idea that she had staged a performance for an audience far less sympathetic than she imagined. I exited the vehicle slowly, giving the moment a gravity it didn't deserve, but one she clearly expected. The neighborhood was quiet, with only the buzz of long-distance equipment and the faint hum of morning traffic breaking the stillness. A few residents stood discreetly at windows or from their porches, watching with expressions that suggested the spectacle was long overdue and mildly entertaining. Karen approached me with brisk, indignant steps. Her breath came quick from the energy of her own outrage. She didn't even pause to assess who I was. She launched directly into her rehearsed performance, unaware that the very person she was about to accuse was standing right in front of her. While she spoke, I let her rattle on uninterrupted. The words poured out of her like a dam breaking. Claims of unauthorized vehicles, suspicious behavior, refusal to comply with HOA guidelines, and her insistence that she possessed a master key, granting her the authority to inspect anything she deemed necessary. She never acknowledged the legal reality that HOA rules did not supersede property rights, nor did she show any awareness that attempting to open someone's locked vehicle was a crime far greater than any fictional infraction she imagined she was correcting. It was almost impressive how thoroughly she believed her own narrative. I walked toward my driveway at a measured pace, observing her gestures and listening to her exaggerated account. She pointed repeatedly at my SUV, describing it as if it were some ominous vehicle left by unknown trespassers. She claimed the key she attempted to use should have granted her access, and that the failure of the key indicated tampering or violation of neighborhood policies. The audacity was astonishing, even for someone with her track record. I stepped back toward her, keeping my expression neutral. She watched me expectantly, ready for her validation, ready for the moment she believed I would confirm her authority. That expectation hung in the air like fog, thick and suffocating, ready to collapse the moment truth hit it. But I didn't reveal anything yet. Not my identity as the car owner, not my familiarity with her antics, not my position as the sheriff she had unwittingly summoned. No, the situation needed to unfold with clarity and procedure, and Karen needed to expose her own motivations without influence. She continued pacing, insisting that immediate enforcement action was necessary. She declared the vehicle a threat to the safety and uniform aesthetic of Fairview Meadows. She insisted residents had the right to inspect suspicious property whenever they wished, and that the HOA bylaws, her interpretation of them at least, gave her full jurisdiction. That is when her facade began to slip. It happened subtly at first. A twitch in her jaw, a narrowing of the eyes, a shift of weight as she realized I wasn't reacting with the urgency she expected. She asked whether I understood the gravity of the situation. She questioned whether I recognized the potential danger of allowing an unknown car to remain uninspected. She demanded that I take action. And finally, she asked why I hadn't opened the door yet. That was her mistake. Up until then, everything she said could have been attributed to ignorance, delusion, or the inflated ego of someone who believed she had more authority than she did. But demanding that law enforcement break into a resident's locked vehicle based solely on her hunch crossed the line from irritating to incriminating. I allowed the silence to hang, just long enough for her to feel it, to sense that the situation was no longer unfolding according to her script. The air felt heavy with the tension of a truth hovering just out of reach. Even the neighbors seemed to sense it. Curtains shifted, heads leaned slightly forward, and a quiet anticipation settled over the cul-de-sac. Karen clasped her keyring tighter, as though the metal might validate her authority. She insisted once more that she had a master key and that the car door should have yielded. She said it with a certainty that bordered on obsession. And that is when I finally let the first crack of truth emerge. Slow, intentional, measured. I reached toward my vest and pulled out my badge. The reveal didn't come yet, not fully, but the badge glinted in the sunlight, catching Karen's eye. She froze, confusion flickering across her expression as she processed the contradiction between the story she'd crafted and the reality now forming in front of her. It was the beginning of her unraveling, the moment her false authority collided with actual authority. And it was only going to get worse for her.
The glint of the badge lingered in the air like a suspended blade, catching the morning light in a way that forced awareness upon anyone looking directly at it. Karen's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the faintest tightening around her eyes giving away the confusion beginning to needle through her self-assured narrative. She stared at the badge as though trying to decide whether it was real or some elaborate prop meant to inconvenience her. The entire cul-de-sac seemed to inhale at once, neighbors quiet and poised at the edges of their doorways, waiting for the tension to snap. But I didn't speak. Not yet. The badge simply hung in my hand, understated and patiently demanding recognition. I let the silence stretch long enough for Karen's discomfort to bloom, long enough for her mind to attempt reconciling the impossible, that the officer she summoned did not fit the role she had prepared for him. Karen took a step back, her posture losing the rigid confidence she'd been projecting since the moment she dialed 911. Her gaze darted between the badge, my uniform, and the SUV she had aggressively tampered with, as though the relationship between these elements defied the laws of her personal universe. The calculations happening behind her eyes were visible, awkward, disjointed, and increasingly panicked. I returned the badge to my vest with slow deliberation, letting the act itself punctuate the moment. The click of the clasp echoed faintly in the still air, marking the point where her narrative and the real narrative diverged into two irreconcilable paths. The neighbors sensed the shift immediately. A few stepped out onto their porches, pretending to check mail or sweep steps while their eyes remained locked on the unfolding scene. They recognized the change. The moment her authority cracked under the weight of actual jurisdiction. They had been subjected to her enforcement for years, and now they watched with an anticipation brewing deep in their chests, something between vindication and relief. I turned back to Karen's self-proclaimed suspicious vehicle. The scratches near the door glinted slightly, faint but undeniable. Her failed attempts with the keys had left shallow but visible marks along the paint. They formed a subtle constellation of evidence, each one a testament to her stubbornness and intrusion. When I looked at her again, she followed my gaze and paled. The implication hung between us, unspoken but heavy. Damage to a vehicle was not something she could explain away with bylaws or self-appointed authority. And tampering with a locked car certainly wasn't covered by any HOA handbook she carried around like scripture. Karen lifted her chin, attempting to reclaim the composure slipping through her fingers. She adjusted her posture, smoothed her vest, and stood taller, as though height alone might restore her dominance. But her voice wavered slightly as she began to justify herself, reciting pieces of HOA regulations with increasing desperation, clinging to fragments of power that no longer held relevance. I listened without reaction, letting every word settle into the air like brittle leaves. Her argument rested on the notion that she was acting in service of the community, safeguarding property against unknown threats, performing a civic duty. But her eyes betrayed her, darting, uncertain, searching for some sign of validation that wasn't coming. The truth was simple. She had overstepped, and she knew it.
As she continued, her voice grew louder, more frantic, swelling with the kind of forced authority that collapses under scrutiny. She invoked the HOA repeatedly, insisting she had the right to inspect anything she considered a risk. The neighbors watched, their expressions shifting from curiosity to restrained disbelief. They had seen her weaponize these same claims for years, but never under the scrutiny of the sheriff. I walked closer to the car, examining the scratches again with a calm detachment that only amplified her anxiety. She followed me, hovering at my side like a malfunctioning siren desperate to reclaim attention. Her fingers tightened around the keyring, knuckles whitening, as though the metallic weight might anchor her slipping confidence. And then came the question, the one she had been avoiding even in her own mind. She asked whether the vehicle belonged to someone on the street. Her tone attempted casual curiosity, but each syllable vibrated with dread. She wanted to believe it was a visitor, an outsider, someone she could displace without consequence, someone she could eject to reassert control, someone who wouldn't challenge her self-built structure of dominance. I let the question linger, meeting her eyes just long enough for discomfort to bloom once more. Her breath faltered, her grip tightened further, and the neighbors leaned forward subtly, sensing the moment building like a slow, controlled detonation. And then, with the same measured calm I had maintained from the beginning, I turned toward my driveway and walked up to my house. Karen stared, confused, her confusion evolving into disbelief as I approached my own front steps. I paused at the walkway, letting the realization inch closer to her in the space between our positions. The truth traveled to her in slow waves. The sheriff she summoned had arrived, yes, but not to validate her sense of authority. He was at home. Her gaze snapped between me, the house, the car, and the uniform like a series of mismatched puzzle pieces she was desperately trying to force together. She stepped backward once, then twice, her certainty crumbling in real time. The structure of her confidence, built on years of bullying, posturing, and unearned power, wavered visibly. And then, the final realization hit her. The vehicle she had attempted to open didn't belong to a stranger. It belonged to the sheriff. Her face blanched, her mouth parted slightly, the shape of a breath caught between panic and regret. Her hands trembled around the keyring, a tiny metallic tremor betraying the collapse of her control. She finally understood. Her world had stopped spinning in the direction she dictated, and now, because of her own insistence, her own call, her own overreach, it spun toward consequences she never imagined would apply to her. The cul-de-sac remained utterly silent, mirroring the shock radiating from her. And at that exact moment, with the weight of realization anchoring her to the pavement, the only thing that remained was what came next. The response, the accountability, the unraveling.
The air in the cul-de-sac thickened as the truth settled over it like an unexpected storm cloud, heavy and impossible to ignore. Karen stood frozen in the center of the pavement, her keyring dangling from her trembling hand, the metal catching tiny glints of sunlight that felt strangely accusatory. The quiet that followed her realization was not peaceful, it was taut, expectant, charged with a stillness that made each second stretch far longer than it should. The neighbors sensed the shift even before she fully processed it. They lingered silently at the edges of their porches, bodies still but eyes sharp, the tension drawing them in like spectators at a slow unraveling they'd anticipated, perhaps even hoped for, but never dared expect to witness so clearly. They watched not with cruelty, but with the unspoken relief of people who had lived too long under the weight of someone else's self-appointed authority. Karen's breath stuttered unevenly, her chest rising and falling in shallow bursts. Her eyes darted across the scene. The car she damaged, the house she now understood belonged to the sheriff, the uniformed man standing several feet away surveying the situation with the calm control of someone who had seen far worse and dealt with it far more efficiently. Her mind scrambled to rearrange the narrative she had clung to so tightly just minutes earlier, the illusion of power slipping through her fingers. I stepped back toward the SUV, not rushing, not provoking, simply moving with the deliberate clarity of someone preparing to make a record of the events at hand. The sound of my boots on the driveway echoed softly, each step a reminder that the dynamic had shifted in a way she could not reverse. The evidence was no longer theoretical or arguable. It was scratched plainly into the paint, visible under the mid-morning sun. When I reached the driver's door, I crouched slightly and inspected the damaged area with calm precision. Karen's breath hitched audibly behind me. She took a tentative step forward, as though proximity might mitigate the consequences forming in front of her. But the closer she came, the more she realized that nothing about this situation would be softened by apology or explanation. The law did not bend to HOA politics. It did not yield to delusion or entitlement. It certainly did not make exceptions for someone simply because she believed herself to be untouchable. I straightened and turned toward her. The movement was small, but the impact on the gathering tension was immediate. Karen's shoulders jerked slightly, her grip tightening on the keys as though she feared dropping them might somehow make everything worse, or perhaps simply reveal how deeply she was shaking. The neighbors didn't move. Their silent presence created an unspoken boundary, an acknowledgement that this moment belonged not just to Karen and the sheriff she had unwittingly summoned, but to the entire street that had endured her inflated sense of jurisdiction for too long. I approached her with a measured calm, my step steady and unhurried. The distance closed slowly, giving her time to absorb the gravity inch by inch. She shifted her weight awkwardly, unsure whether to stand firm or retreat. Her uncertainty rippled through her posture, betraying the collapse of the authority she once wielded without hesitation. She began to speak then, words pushing out in a clumsy rush, each one tripping over the next. She explained, justified, minimized, redirected. She invoked concern for the neighborhood, claimed suspicion about the unknown vehicle, insisted she had acted responsibly under the authority of the HOA. The words came faster and faster, as though sheer quantity might drown out the truth of her actions. But the truth remained stubbornly present, carved into the side of my SUV. Her voice faltered when she recognized that nothing she said was impacting my expression. She switched tactics, her tone shifting from indignant to conciliatory, trying to soothe the situation she had set ablaze with her own decisions. But every explanation, every excuse, only underscored the fact that she understood exactly how deeply she had miscalculated. I lifted my hand, not to silence her, but simply to pause her frantic stream of self-preservation. The gesture was calm, professional, but it hit her like a physical force. She stopped speaking abruptly, her mouth still open as though the next excuse had been caught mid-breath. The silence that followed was decisive. I stepped past her and retrieved my body camera from the patrol SUV. The subtle click as it snapped into place on my vest seemed to echo across the cul-de-sac. Karen swallowed hard. Her eyes widened slightly, the color draining from her cheeks. She understood the implication immediately. The moment the camera turned on, The situation moved from unfortunate misunderstanding to formal record. I activated it. A soft beep confirmed recording had begun. Karen's shoulders collapsed inward. The authority she had manufactured for herself had vanished entirely, replaced by the stark awareness of real accountability. She held the keyring loosely now, the metal no longer clutched in confidence, but dangling with the weight of impending consequences. I began documenting the scene verbally, narrating the presence of visible scratches, the attempted entry, the caller's statements, and the sequence of events as they had unfolded. Karen stood silently, the reality of the situation pressing tighter around her with each recorded sentence. She glanced instinctively at the neighbors, but none offered her the validation she had assumed she could rely on. Their expressions remained neutral, almost detached, the collective detachment of people who had lived too long under the weight of someone else's self-appointed authority. I noted the keyring in her hand, its mismatched collection of metal pieces clinking softly as she fidgeted nervously. The so-called master key, the symbol of her imagined authority, the instrument of her undoing. I asked to see it. She hesitated only a moment before surrendering the ring. When the cold metal touched my glove, she visibly deflated. It was as though relinquishing the keys meant relinquishing the entire identity she had crafted around them. The keys were heavy, not just physically but symbolically, collected from past positions, abandoned facilities, and unauthorized copies she'd acquired over time. It was a mess of mismatched authority she had wielded without oversight, and now laid bare under the scrutiny of the law. I held them for a moment, their weight settling into the gravity of the moment. Then I clipped them to a sealed evidence pouch. Karen's composure cracked at the sound of the pouch closing. A tiny exhale escaped her, tremulous and uncontrolled. The facade had crumbled. Her reign of self-appointed power was over. But the consequences were only beginning.
The sealed evidence pouch swung lightly from my hand as I stepped away from Karen, its gentle movement the only hint of motion in a scene otherwise frozen by tension. The cul-de-sac had grown eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that settles after an unexpected storm, when everyone waits to see whether the worst has passed or whether another wave is coming. Karen's shoulders sagged inward, her posture no longer radiating authority, but instead curling around the weight of consequences she had never imagined would turn toward her. The neighbors continued to hover subtly at the edges of their property lines, caught between curiosity and vindication. They had endured her behavior for years, her unannounced inspections, her aggressive rule interpretations, her constant demands for compliance. Now, for the first time, the imbalance of power tilted away from her, and the neighborhood watched like witnesses to a long overdue shift. I walked back to my patrol vehicle and retrieved a clipboard, the simple act bringing new structure to the unfolding investigation. The metallic click of the pen drew Karen's gaze immediately, her eyes filling with a mix of apprehension and disbelief. She seemed unable to process that something she initiated had spiraled so decisively out of her control. Every movement I made now, the notes, the procedural organization, the calm professionalism, contrasted sharply with the panic settling over her. As I approached the SUV again to continue documenting the damage, the neighbors finally began to move. One stepped off his porch, another shifted from behind a window to the edge of their walkway. Their steps were cautious, hesitant, but filled with a sense of permission they hadn't felt before. Karen's power had always been rooted in isolation, a single voice wielding authority over many who felt they had none. But now the dynamic had flipped, and once disrupted, fear no longer held them in place. A middle-aged man from across the street cleared his throat softly as he approached, his gaze flicking nervously between me and Karen. He kept a respectful distance, but the way he squared his shoulders showed he was building to something long held in. He asked if he could provide a statement. His request hung in the air, shocking in its suddenness, not because it was unusual for witnesses to step forward, but because this was the first sign that the neighborhood was breaking silent ranks. Karen's expression tightened instantly, panic rippling across her features. She turned toward the man, her lips parting as though she had intended to silence him with the same domineering tone she had used for years, but no words escaped. She saw the badge, the camera, the clipboard, and for the first time she truly understood the width of the chasm she now faced. I agreed to take his statement. He stepped closer, lowering his voice instinctively. He recounted how he had seen Karen attempt to open the SUV, how she had circled it repeatedly, trying different keys with visible frustration. He explained that she had been patrolling the street more aggressively in recent months, seemingly searching for infractions rather than addressing complaints. His voice steadied as he continued, the years of tension unraveling into clarity. He admitted that he and others had felt intimidated by her, as though refusing her demands would lead to harassment, fines, or fabricated violations. His statement wasn't emotional, it was factual, measured, and surprisingly calm. But beneath the surface, the exhaustion was palpable. When I finished recording his words, the neighbors took it as an unspoken cue. One by one, they emerged further from their homes, some timidly, others with a boldness that suggested a dam had finally broken. A woman from 3 doors down stepped forward, explaining that Karen had recently attempted to enter her backyard for inspection purposes. Another couple described receiving warning notices for issues their house didn't even have. A retired man admitted he'd stopped hosting family gatherings outdoors because he couldn't endure her constant confrontations about his noise levels, which were barely above the sound of conversation. Karen stood rigid, her face a shifting landscape of disbelief, humiliation, and unraveling denial. Each statement carried a weight she had never allowed herself to feel, each testimony a thread pulled from the tapestry of control she had wrapped around the neighborhood. As I documented each account, Karen's breathing grew uneven, sharp inhales followed by unsteady exhales. The neighbors didn't speak to her, didn't even look at her directly. Their focus remained on the investigation, on the opportunity to finally set a long-standing imbalance right. The absence of confrontation was more powerful than anger. It signaled that her influence no longer held sway. The more they spoke, the more the full scope of her actions began to take shape. The investigation, originally limited to property damage and an attempted unlawful entry into a vehicle, widened into a potential pattern of harassment, misuse of authority, and intimidation. Nothing exaggerated, nothing dramatic, just truth finally surfacing. When the last neighbor returned to their porch, I turned back to Karen. The sunlight had shifted slightly, casting new angles across her features, revealing a stunned hollowness. The key ring, once her symbol of dominance, hung uselessly at her side. Without it, without her hold over the residence, she seemed suddenly small, like someone who had mistaken control for respect, and now confronted the reality she had long ignored. I informed her procedurally that the investigation would move forward. The words were delivered calmly, professionally, but their impact was seismic. Her shoulders buckled slightly, her weight shifting as though the ground beneath her had softened. She stared at me with a growing sense of desperation, searching for some part of the old dynamic she could cling to, some argument, some rule, some loophole, but none existed. The law did not operate on imagined authority. The neighborhood was no longer silent, and the evidence was no longer in her possession. When I finished outlining the next steps, she said nothing. Her silence wasn't defiance, it was the realization that speaking might only dig the hole deeper. She looked toward the neighbors, hoping one of them, any of them, might step forward with sympathy or support. None did. The cul-de-sac remained still again, but not with fear, with closure, with a shared understanding that accountability had finally arrived. As I stepped away to complete the scene documentation, Karen stood alone on the pavement, dwarfed by the suddenly enormous space around her, space no longer controlled by her, no longer shaped by her authority, and for the first time, the neighborhood breathed freely. By the time the morning sun climbed fully above the rooftops, the cul-de-sac had shifted in a way that felt subtle yet profound. The air no longer carried the oppressive weight of Karen's scrutiny, nor the hush of neighbors afraid to be seen doing something she might disapprove of. Instead, the stillness felt open, like a long-closed window had finally been cracked, letting fresh air drift into a space that had needed it desperately. Karen remained on the pavement, her posture defeated yet carefully controlled, as though she clung to the last frayed threads of her dignity. Her expression had settled into a numb blankness, the kind that follows after the adrenaline has drained from the body. Without her key ring, without the audience she had always believed she commanded, she seemed not just diminished but unanchored, unsure where to place the authority she had lived in for so long. The evidence pouch sat secured in the patrol vehicle. The witness statements, meticulously recorded, formed a stack thick enough to tell a clear, undeniable story. And the scratches on my SUV, though minor, provided the tangible proof her intentions had crossed into criminal territory. The investigation was no longer confined to a single incident. It had expanded into a comprehensive review of her conduct as HOA president and the ways she had leveraged her position to intimidate and harass residents. When reinforcements arrived, a second deputy and an administrative officer, they approached with the steady professionalism of seasoned law enforcement familiar with delicate neighborhood disputes. Their presence alone underscored the seriousness of the unfolding events. Karen stiffened when she saw them, her chin lifting instinctively as though she expected the type of deference she once commanded. But the deputies did not greet her with the familiarity she craved. They addressed her as a subject of an investigation, not as a community figurehead. Together, we reviewed the gathered information. The other officers walked the street, confirming statements, noting additional resident concerns, and gathering corroborating accounts. The neighborhood participated with a level of cooperation that revealed just how deeply frustration had been brewing beneath the surface. Each testimony further dismantled the illusion that Karen's authority had ever been legitimate or welcome. Her narrative she had built for herself was collapsing under the weight of verifiable reality. Karen watched this all unfold with growing anxiety. She attempted to interject at moments, small frantic movements, subtle steps forward, but each time she was met with a calm, procedural boundary she could not circumvent. Law enforcement functioned on facts, not self-perception, and the facts were stacked firmly against her. When the preliminary findings were consolidated, the administrative officer explained her immediate options. She was placed under notice of investigation for attempted unlawful entry into a motor vehicle, property damage, harassment, and potential abuse of authority within her role at the HOA. These weren't charges yet, but formal steps toward accountability. The tone remained professional, but nothing about it was optional. She nodded mechanically, her earlier bravado replaced with an almost stunned compliance. The officer advised her that, effective immediately, she was suspended from all HOA-related responsibilities, pending the review. Her master key ring collection would remain in evidence. She would not be permitted to conduct inspections, issue notices, or act in any official HOA capacity. It was the administrative version of being disarmed. Karen blinked rapidly as the words settled. Her identity, so enmeshed with the power she exerted, had been stripped away in the space of a single morning. She had envisioned herself as the neighborhood's guardian, its enforcer, its highest authority. Now she stood on the asphalt, absorbing the realization that her authority had always been a construct of her own making, maintained only because others hadn't dared challenge it. When the officers concluded their briefing and stepped aside, she remained rooted in place. Her eyes scanned the street, the houses, the familiar spaces she once controlled. But no sympathetic gaze met hers. The neighbors had receded respectfully, not out of fear, but because the spectacle had ended and life was returning to the quiet normalcy they hadn't realized they'd been missing. A few exchanged subtle nods with one another, acknowledging a collective weight lifted. Karen turned slightly, and her gaze settled on me. There was no malice there now, no defiance, just the hollow expression of someone confronting an unexpected downfall. She looked at the chipped edges of the driveway, at the SUV she had tried so insistently to open, and then at the badge glinting against my vest. The realization had long since sunk in, but now it seemed to gain a deeper clarity. She had summoned the sheriff against the sheriff. But I offered no gloating, no superiority. That wasn't the point. This wasn't about settling a score or making an example. It was about upholding the law and protecting a community from someone who had long mistaken authority for entitlement. It was about restoring balance. As the investigation team wrapped up, I provided the final procedural overview. Karen listened quietly. Her face, once animated by indignation or control, now looked strangely small, as though stripped of the persona she had cultivated so carefully. She nodded at the appropriate moments, murmured brief acknowledgments, and kept her eyes low. By the time she was dismissed with instructions to await further contact, she looked like someone walking away from the remnants of her own myth. She made her way back to her house, steps slow and unsteady. The heavy silence that followed her departure wasn't filled with tension, it was filled with relief. Bit by bit, the cul-de-sac exhaled. The neighbors gradually drifted back into their routines. Someone resumed trimming their hedges. Another retrieved a forgotten mug of coffee from their porch railing. A couple stepped out with their dog, strolling with a casual ease absent in the neighborhood in years. The rhythm of normal life returned with startling speed, as though the morning had scratched away an entirely different world. As I packed away the last of the documentation and prepared to clear the scene, one neighbor offered a subdued but grateful nod. Others mirrored it quietly, a constellation of small acknowledgments from people who rarely spoke up, but whose relief was unmistakable. They didn't need to say anything. Their relaxed shoulders, their unguarded movements, their soft expressions said enough. The HOA would reconvene soon, likely without Karen. The neighborhood would adjust. Peace often fills the spaces left behind by unchecked authority. As I climbed into my patrol vehicle and prepared to leave, I glanced once more toward her house. The curtains in the front window shifted slightly, not in surveillance, not in suspicion, but in a quiet, humbled stillness. The reign of the HOA's self-appointed monarch had ended. Fairview Meadows, for the first time in a long while, felt like a community again.